The strange thing about retirement is that people spend years telling you how peaceful it will feel when the hard work finally ends, but nobody ever warns you about the silence that arrives afterward, or the way the world slowly begins to look through you as if you have already faded into the background of your own life. For most of my adult years, I woke before sunrise, drank coffee while the city was still dark outside my kitchen window. My hands built things. My decisions mattered. My effort carried weight inside my family because every paycheck I brought home helped create the life my wife and children enjoyed for decades. Then one morning, everything stopped. My name is Thomas Ben. After 42 years working as an electrician across Seattle, climbing ladders in freezing rain, crawling through unfinished walls, and spending entire winters repairing damaged systems in buildings where the heat barely worked, I officially retired. At 68 years old, my coworkers shook my hand during a small gathering at the company warehouse near Sodo, and several of the younger men joked that I would probably become restless after only a few weeks away from work because men like me never really learn how to sit still. At the time, I laughed along with them because I believed retirement would finally give me something life had rarely allowed before: time with family. My wife had passed away 7 years earlier after a long illness, and since then my entire focus remained on staying useful to the people I loved. My son Ryan convinced me to move into the lower floor of his house in West Seattle shortly before my retirement, insisting that family should stay close together as we grew older. At the time, his offer felt sincere and comforting, especially after years of living alone in the quiet house where every room still carried memories of my wife. I truly believed those final years of my life would be filled with family dinners, conversations, laughter from my grandchildren someday, and the kind of warmth people describe when they talk about growing old surrounded by the 5 people they sacrificed everything for. Instead, I slowly discovered something far colder. The first few weeks after retirement felt normal enough. Ryan continued, leaving early each morning for his sales job downtown while his wife Melissa rushed through the kitchen balancing coffee cups, work calls, and endless complaints about traffic, schedules, and expenses. I stayed busy, trying not to feel unnecessary. I cleaned around the house, repaired loose fixtures, organized the garage, and even handled small maintenance projects Ryan kept postponing for months. At first, I believed those things helped, but over time I began noticing how invisible my presence had become inside the house. Nobody asked how I was adjusting to retirement. Nobody asked whether I felt lonely spending entire days alone while they worked. Most evenings, Ryan and Melissa returned home exhausted, disappearing upstairs almost immediately after dinner while I remained downstairs watching television simply to hear human voices filling the silence. Weeks passed that way, then months. The routine slowly transformed into something painful because I began realizing that my role inside the family had quietly changed. From father to inconvenience, Ryan no longer spoke to me like a son seeking advice or connection. Most conversations revolved around bills, repairs, or small favors he needed handled while he worked. Melissa barely attempted to hide her irritation whenever my presence disrupted the image of independence she wanted inside her home. She never said anything openly cruel in the beginning, but resentment has a way of revealing itself through small gestures long before words arrive. The heavy sighs when I entered the kitchen, the impatient expressions whenever I tried joining conversations, the way she rearranged family plans without ever considering whether I might feel excluded. My daughter Claire was not much different, although her distance carried a quieter form of neglect. She lived in Bellevue with her husband and rarely visited unless she needed help with something financial or practical. Whenever she called, the conversations felt rushed and distracted, as if speaking to her aging father had become another responsibility squeezed between more important parts of her life. Still, I continued making excuses for them. I told myself modern life was stressful. I told myself younger generations simply expressed love differently. I told myself many things because accepting the truth would have forced me to confront a loneliness I was not ready to face. Then came the evening that changed everything. Ryan and Melissa hosted a dinner party for several friends one rainy Saturday night in late November. The house filled with music, expensive food, and loud conversation drifting downstairs from the upper level while I remained quietly in my room reading an old book simply to avoid making anyone uncomfortable. At some point during the evening, I walked upstairs intending to make coffee. After the guests had settled into the dining room, I moved quietly through the kitchen, trying not to interrupt anyone, when I heard Melissa speaking from the next room. Her voice carried clearly through the partially open doorway. She was laughing while explaining how difficult life had become since having an old, retired parent permanently around the house. The words stopped me instantly. I remained standing beside the kitchen counter while her conversation continued. Without hesitation, Melissa described me the way people describe unwanted furniture taking up too much space in a crowded room. She complained about losing privacy. She complained about expenses increasing after my retirement. She complained about feeling trapped inside a home where she constantly had to think about someone old being nearby. Then came the sentence I still remember with painful clarity even now. She said retirement had turned me into a man with nothing left except spare time. The room erupted with uncomfortable laughter afterward, the kind people use when they know something cruel has been said but lack the courage to challenge it directly. What hurt most was not Melissa's words. It was Ryan's silence. My own son heard every word and said nothing to defend me. Not one sentence, not one attempt to remind his wife that the man she mocked spent decades sacrificing comfort so he could grow up safe, educated, and financially secure. I stood there for several long seconds feeling something inside me quietly collapse. The strange part was that I did not feel anger immediately. I felt emptiness, a deep, exhausting emptiness that slowly spread through my chest while the conversation upstairs continued as if nothing important had happened. I returned downstairs without making coffee. That night I sat alone in my room, listening to rain strike the windows while memories replayed endlessly inside my mind. I remembered working overtime during harsh winters so Ryan could attend college without debt. I remembered postponing vacations for years because Claire needed tuition money. I remembered standing beside hospital beds, repairing their broken cars late at night, helping with down payments, and spending most of my adult life making sure my children never carried burdens heavier than necessary. And now, after retirement, I had become something they tolerated rather than valued. The following morning, nobody mentioned the conversation from the night before. Melissa behaved normally. Ryan avoided eye contact during breakfast. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument could have. For the first time since moving into that house, I began questioning whether family closeness had ever truly been the reason Ryan invited me there after retirement, or whether I had simply become another financial convenience inside a household, struggling to maintain the lifestyle they wanted. That thought remained with me throughout the following weeks while the emotional distance inside the house grew harder to ignore. I started taking long walks through Ally Beach during afternoons simply to avoid sitting alone downstairs listening to the muffled sounds of a family life happening above me without my involvement. The cold ocean air often felt less lonely than the silence waiting inside the house. One afternoon during those walks I met my old friend Walter Hayes for coffee near the waterfront. Walter retired from electrical work several years before I did, and unlike me, he seemed strangely at peace with aging. After a few minutes of conversation, he studied my face carefully and asked a simple question that caught me completely off guard. He asked whether I was actually happy living with Ryan and Melissa. Nobody had asked me that before, not once since my retirement. For a moment, I considered giving the polite answer people usually offer to avoid uncomfortable truths, but something about the exhaustion in my own reflection staring back from the cafe window made honesty feel unavoidable. And deep down, perhaps for the first time, I realized I already knew the answer. There is a particular kind of loneliness that only appears when you are surrounded by people who no longer truly see you. Living alone can be painful in its own way, but existing inside a house filled with family while feeling emotionally invisible creates a deeper exhaustion that slowly settles into every part of your life. After that dinner party in West Seattle, the house no longer felt like a home where I belonged. It felt like a place where I was temporarily tolerated as long as I remained quiet, useful, and easy to ignore. Once a person notices the truth, it becomes impossible to stop seeing it. Every small interaction began revealing things I had spent months trying not to acknowledge. Melissa no longer even attempted to hide her irritation whenever my routine interrupted hers. If I happened to enter the kitchen while she prepared breakfast, her expression tightened slightly as though my presence complicated the flow of her morning. If I sat in the living room during evenings, she found reasons to disappear upstairs with Ryan rather than spend time downstairs where I was sitting. Ryan himself became more distant. With each passing week, the warmth that once existed between us had slowly been replaced by short conversations focused almost entirely on practical matters. He rarely asked how I was feeling or whether retirement had become difficult emotionally. Instead, he spoke about utility bills, household expenses, maintenance projects, and the rising costs of living in Seattle, as if those topics naturally outweighed every other part of our relationship. One rainy evening in January, while we sat at the kitchen table after dinner, Ryan began discussing finances in a tone that sounded strangely rehearsed. He explained how expensive the house had become to maintain and how stressful modern life felt with mortgage payments, insurance, and rising property taxes consuming so much of their monthly income. At first I believed he simply needed someone to listen. Then the conversation slowly shifted. He mentioned retirement communities near Tacoma that offered comfortable, independent living for older people. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with obvious caution, but the meaning beneath the conversation remained painfully clear. He was introducing the idea of me leaving. Not directly, not yet, but the possibility had entered his mind long before that evening. I listened quietly while he explained how some retirees preferred having their own space surrounded by people their age instead of living with younger families balancing careers and responsibilities. Throughout the conversation, I noticed something that hurt more than the words themselves. Ryan spoke as though my existence had become a logistical issue requiring long-term planning. Not once did he ask whether I wanted to leave. Not once did he consider what that suggestion might feel like for a father who spent decades building his entire life around the well-being of his children. Melissa remained mostly silent during the conversation, but her silence carried agreement. I could see it in the relieved expression that briefly crossed her face whenever Ryan mentioned retirement, communities, or independent living arrangements. That night I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling downstairs while rain moved softly against the windows outside. The house above me creaked occasionally with footsteps and muffled movement, small reminders that an entire life continued upstairs while I remained isolated below. It like a forgotten guest overstaying his welcome. For the first time since my retirement, I allowed myself to imagine leaving, not because they wanted me gone, but because staying had started destroying something inside me that I could no longer afford to lose. My dignity. Over the following weeks, the emotional distance inside the house deepened further. Claire rarely visited anymore, and when she did, her attention remained fixed on her phone or whatever personal stress currently dominated her life. She still called occasionally, whenever she needed financial help or advice about something practical, but the conversations always ended quickly once her needs were addressed. One afternoon she visited unexpectedly while Ryan and Melissa were at work. For a brief moment, I felt hopeful that perhaps she genuinely wanted to spend time together. Instead, the conversation turned toward money within 20 minutes. Claire explained that she and her husband were considering purchasing a larger house in Bellevue, but rising interest rates had complicated their plans. She spoke carefully, at first circling around the subject before eventually suggesting that perhaps I could assist with part of the down payment, temporarily until they stabilized financially. Listening to her speak, I realized something deeply painful. Both of my children still viewed me as useful financially, They simply no longer valued me emotionally. The realization settled heavily inside my chest after she left that afternoon. I sat alone near the downstairs window, watching cars move through the wet Seattle streets while memories of my children's childhood returned. With exhausting clarity, I remembered carrying Ryan on my shoulders during summer festivals near the waterfront when he was too tired to walk home. I remembered helping Claire practice multiplication tables late at night while she cried in frustration at the kitchen table. I remembered working overtime shifts for years so they could have braces, sports equipment, school trips, and opportunities I never experienced growing up myself. Those memories once filled me with pride. Now they filled me with grief because somewhere along the way my children stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as a resource. Only Walter seemed capable of recognizing what was happening to me. We began meeting regularly at a small cafe near beach during afternoons after he noticed how withdrawn I had become. Walter listened patiently while I slowly described the emotional atmosphere inside Ryan's house, the growing tension, the isolation, and the constant feeling that my existence had become inconvenient to the people I loved most. Unlike me, Walter did not make excuses for them. He spoke plainly in the way older men sometimes do after reaching an age where honesty matters more than politeness. He told me something during one of those afternoons that remained in my mind long afterward. He said many families celebrate a parent's sacrifices while they still need those sacrifices. But once usefulness fades, respect often disappears alongside it. At first I resisted hearing that truth. No father wants to believe his children value him only when he provides something tangible. But deep down I already knew Walter was right. The breaking point came several weeks later during another gathering at the house. Melissa invited several co-workers for dinner one Saturday evening, and once again, I remained downstairs hoping to avoid making anyone uncomfortable. Around 9 o'clock I walked upstairs intending to grab a glass of water after assuming the guests were occupied in the dining room. As I approached the kitchen, I heard Melissa speaking again. This time her tone carried open frustration rather than forced politeness. She complained about how difficult it felt to fully enjoy their home with an old retired man constantly downstairs. She joked that retirement seemed to transform older parents into permanent house guests who never leave. The laughter that followed sounded sharper this time, more comfortable, as though mocking me had slowly become normal entertainment inside that house. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Melissa said she sometimes felt like she was waiting for life to move forward again. I understood exactly what she meant. And once again, Ryan said nothing. That silence finally destroyed the last illusion I had been protecting. I returned downstairs slowly while an overwhelming calm settled over me. The kind of calm that often arrives after pain reaches a level where emotions simply stop fighting reality. For days afterward, I thought carefully about my life, my finances, and the years I still had remaining. Retirement suddenly looked very different from the future I once imagined. I realized something important during those quiet nights alone downstairs. I was not trapped. I still had savings. I still had pension income. I still had enough strength left to build a peaceful life for myself somewhere else. Most importantly, I still had the right to choose dignity over emotional dependency. One afternoon after meeting Walter for coffee, I drove alone toward Port Townsend. After he mentioned how peaceful the coastal town felt during retirement, the moment I arrived and saw the gray ocean stretching endlessly beyond the shoreline, something inside me loosened. For the first time in months that the town felt quiet, calm, untouched by the emotional exhaustion waiting back in Seattle. I spent hours walking along the waterfront imagining what life might feel like if I stopped begging silently for affection from people who only noticed me when they needed something. And by the time I drove back home that evening, one quiet decision had already formed clearly inside my mind. My family believed retirement had made me weak, dependent, and emotionally trapped inside their version of my future. What they did not realize was that I had finally stopped waiting for them to care. And once that happened, everything began to change. The strange thing about emotional exhaustion is that once it reaches a certain point, sadness slowly transforms into clarity. During the months after my visit to Port Townsend, I stopped wasting energy trying to repair relationships that only seemed important when I was sacrificing something for them. For years I believed love inside a family naturally guaranteed loyalty, respect, and emotional closeness, but retirement forced me to confront a far more uncomfortable truth. Some people only value your presence when your usefulness benefits their lives. Once I accepted that reality, my decisions became much easier. I began preparing quietly. Every morning, I woke before sunrise like I had done for decades during my working years. Except now my routines no longer revolved around the needs of the household upstairs. Instead, I spent my time reviewing finances, meeting privately with advisors, and searching for small coastal properties near Port Townsend where I could finally build a peaceful life untouched by the constant feeling of being unwanted. Ryan and Melissa noticed the changes in me eventually, although neither of them understood what they truly meant. I stopped volunteering for endless repairs around the house. I stopped rearranging my schedule around their convenience. I stopped sitting upstairs during dinner hoping to feel included in conversations that rarely acknowledged my existence anyway. Most importantly, I stopped emotionally chasing my own children. That shift confused them more than anger ever would have. For years they had grown comfortable with the assumption that I would always remain available, no matter how carelessly they treated me. They believed retirement had left me dependent on their approval and companionship. What they failed to understand was that emotional dependence only survives while someone still believes rejection can be repaired through effort. I had finally reached the point where I no longer believed that. One evening in early spring, Ryan approached me downstairs after returning home from work, looking unusually tense. Financial pressure had clearly begun tightening around him over recent months. Melissa's spending habits had never matched their actual income, and the comfortable lifestyle they projected to friends relied far more heavily on stability than either of them wanted to admit. He explained that certain expenses had become difficult recently and suggested that perhaps I could contribute more consistently toward household costs since I was living there full-time. The request itself did not surprise me. What surprised me was how calmly I reacted. Months earlier, the conversation would have deeply hurt me because I still viewed myself primarily as a father trying to preserve emotional closeness with his family. But standing there downstairs listening to Ryan carefully explain why additional financial support would help everyone, I suddenly saw the relationship with painful clarity. My presence inside that house carried value only when attached to usefulness. I agreed politely to think about his request. Then, later that same week, I finalized the purchase of a small coastal home overlooking the water just outside Port Townsend. The property was modest compared to Ryan's house in Seattle, but the moment I walked through it for the first time, I felt something I had not experienced in years: peace. The house stood near a quiet stretch of shoreline where mornings arrived slowly beneath gray skies, and the sound of waves replaced the constant emotional tension that had filled my life in Seattle. There were no forced conversations there, no silent resentment hanging in the air, no feeling that my existence inconvenienced the people around me. For the first time since retirement, the future no longer felt empty. I told nobody about the purchase. Instead, I spent several weeks preparing quietly while arranging movers, transferring accounts, and organizing the life I planned to leave behind. Then came the evening everything finally changed. Ryan and Melissa hosted another dinner gathering at the house, inviting several friends and co-workers for drinks and conversation upstairs, while I remained downstairs as usual. The muffled sounds of laughter drifted through the ceiling while I packed the last few boxes inside my room. At some point during the evening, I walked upstairs intending to retrieve a few documents from the hallway closet before returning downstairs unnoticed. But as I approached the kitchen, I heard Melissa speaking again. Her voice carried the same irritation I had heard many times before, except this time there was no effort at politeness left. She complained openly about how difficult life had become since my retirement. She described me as emotionally draining, financially unhelpful, and permanently occupying space that prevented them from fully enjoying their own lives. Then she laughed while saying something that finally erased every remaining ounce of doubt inside me. She said she sometimes wondered how much longer they would need to carry me before life could finally feel normal again. The guests laughed softly, and once again, my son said nothing. That silence became the final answer to every question. I had spent months asking myself. I returned downstairs calmly and finished packing the remaining boxes, without anger or hesitation. Sometime after midnight, once the guests left and the house became quiet again, I placed a single envelope on the kitchen counter before going to sleep. The following morning I woke before anyone else. I looked around the downstairs room one final time while early sunlight filtered weakly through the windows, and I realized I felt nothing close to regret, only relief. By the time Ryan and Melissa woke up, the moving truck had already arrived outside. Confusion spread across Ryan's face the moment he walked downstairs and saw the packed boxes. I explained calmly that I had purchased a home near Port Townsend and would be leaving permanently that morning. At first, neither of them seemed to fully understand what was happening. Then Ryan found the envelope, sitting on the kitchen counter. Inside was a letter explaining several things clearly. I informed them that my retirement savings, pension contributions, and monthly financial support would no longer remain connected to their household. I reminded Ryan that many of the expenses keeping their lifestyle stable had quietly depended on my presence, far more than he realized. Most importantly, I explained that I no longer wished to live somewhere my existence felt tolerated rather than valued. For the first time in months, Ryan looked genuinely shaken. Melissa remained silent while reality slowly settled across her face. But by then, something inside me had already moved beyond needing apologies. Leaving Seattle that morning felt strangely peaceful. As the city disappeared behind me during the long drive toward the coast, I realized how emotionally heavy my life had become without me fully noticing it. Years of quiet neglect had exhausted me more deeply than physical labor ever had. Port Townsend changed me slowly after that. The quiet mornings near the ocean gave me space to breathe again. I began fishing occasionally, reading books I ignored for decades, and spending afternoons walking along the shoreline without constantly wondering whether I was unwanted somewhere else. Walter visited often, and for the first time since my wife passed away, life began feeling calm instead of lonely. Meanwhile, things in Seattle slowly unraveled. Without my consistent financial support, Ryan and Melissa struggled far more quickly than expected. Their spending habits collided with reality once the invisible safety net I provided disappeared. Arguments became frequent. Stress consumed the household that once treated me like a burden. Claire visited me several months later. The guilt in her face appeared before she even stepped inside the house. She admitted that both she and Ryan had spent years assuming I would always remain available no matter how carelessly they behaved. Retirement made them focus so heavily on their own lives that they stopped seeing me as a person with emotions, loneliness, and dignity. I listened quietly while she spoke, but something fundamental inside me had changed during those months near the ocean. I still loved my children. That would never disappear. But love no longer meant sacrificing my peace to remain close to people who only appreciated me after I walked away. One evening nearly a year later, I stood alone near the shoreline, watching sunlight disappear slowly across the water while cold wind moved through the quiet coastal air. And for the first time in many years, I felt emotionally free. Retirement had not ended my life the way my family quietly believed. It had simply revealed who truly valued me. Once my usefulness disappeared, and sometimes the most painful lesson people learn comes only after the person they ignored finally stops waiting to be loved properly. So I ask you this question: do you think I made the right decision by leaving my family home? Should parents continue sacrificing for children who no longer respect them?